Good afternoon. It's my thrill, privilege, and honor to be the chairman, although I don't know what a chairman really does, to be surrounded by four of the finest teachers who ever lived, the brass teachers, the greatest in the world. And I'm very thrilled to be just in the middle of this group. I'd like to introduce each of them to you before we start. Over here, Arnold Jacobs, who was my colleague in the Chicago Symphony for 13, 14 years. Dennis Wick from England, we all know by name. Freudis Wecker. Freudis is an old friend and even helped out here at Indiana University during a period of illness on my part, and got to know her students here, and they all love her, as you will. And then Armando Gatalla. Had I not left the Boston Symphony when I did, I would have been a colleague of Armando's, but I left a few years before he came into the Boston Symphony. But we know each other from many years of collaboration in workshops. I think that what we will do is each of us take 5 or 6 minutes of giving our own philosophies, and then open the meeting to questions and answers. I think we're probably best qualified to answer your questions. I wonder if all of you haven't gone through the same experience I have of wondering, as a player, what do I leave to posterity? What am I doing here playing this instrument, and what will happen when I'm gone from the world? What will they remember me for? And then I thought to myself, well, it's this symphony. We played Mahler Fifth last night, and it went well. I walked out of here on a cloud, and that's what they'll remember. The truth is, 2 or 3 weeks later, nobody remembers it except yourself. So that isn't it. That isn't what you're leaving to posterity. Then I thought, wait a minute, it's recordings. That's what it is. Kusevitsky used to tell us in Boston just before we started a recording session, remember, you're not making recordings, you are making historical documents. It was very impressive, and it certainly impressed me. But the truth is that those records which we made were made on 78 revolutions per minute. Then along came long play records, then came stereo, and then came quadraphonic for a short while, and now we have digital recordings. So if you want to hear some of those historical documents that I made, you have to go out to the Bargain City and look at the bottom of a stack of records for 50 cents each. So that wasn't it either. And suddenly it occurred to me, what do I leave to posterity? It's my students. I have students who are preaching what I believe in because I believed in what my teacher believed in and his teacher taught him. And now my students have students who have students. So that this is what you leave to posterity. To me, the most exciting part of the music field is the opportunity to work with young people, your students, and give them your ideas in the hope that they'll enlarge upon these ideas and go on to at least keep your name fresh in their students' minds. And I think this is what teaching is all about. It's the part of music which we can't avoid anyhow. The moment you get a good playing position, you'll be called upon to be a teacher. You can't help it. The day your name gets in the paper that you're the new horn player in the Chicago Symphony, the phone starts ringing and mothers want their son or daughter to study with you. So you can't avoid being a teacher. And as Freudis said earlier at one of our horn meetings, you are a teacher whether you want to be or not, because you're always going to have to teach yourself. So teaching is to me the most satisfying part of the music world. Playing is good, but in a way, playing is only demonstrating to your students what you want them to do later. So let's open this meeting by Starting with who would like to
Ladies
start?
first.
Ladies first.
No,
Oh, well, I think just 5 minutes of your philosophy of teaching. How do you go about teaching, and what do you believe in? I see that our title here is Future and Careers in Pedagogy. Well, all of us have a past as teachers here, so I don't want to keep it down just to futures. We have past experience as teachers, we have a present experience, and there will be a future. There may be many changes in the future, but I think teaching is one of the fields which will remain fairly constant. It's true we've got tape recorders to teach with, and machines that tell us if we're in tune. If we look, you don't have to listen, you just look. And all kinds of modern metronomes with give clicks or buzzes or whatever you want. But I think basically when it comes down to the art of teaching, it's the one-to-one relationship between the teacher and the student. And the machines may help a little, but we'll teach very much as we did in the past, and I hope we'll continue to do this in the future. Now, Freudis, tell us what you think.
My philosophy of teaching, I haven't really put it down seriously to words before. However, I think since I myself had good teachers, I feel I have to pay them back. That's part of my motivation for taking students. Second part is, of course, that I do like it. I like to see that you can help, that you can actually make progress, you can open up minds by small means. My philosophy as far as teaching is that the most important part is the psychological. It is more important to teach self-confidence than to teach the right technique, I think. Of course, it's nice to have the right technique, whatever that is, too. And I try myself to pick up new ideas myself. I occasionally take a lesson here and there. And that always results in revolutionary things for my students. But the main thing is to establish, I think, a good relationship with the student and to trust each other and to be happy for every little progress. I personally take a great pride in making progress with the students, even if they're not very good. It's very hard if you can say you have a first-class talent, and then you have a second-class talent, and then you have a third-class talent. But who is to tell? Sometimes the so-called third-class talent will get up there and play very well because of maybe hard work, maybe good input. Sometimes the so-called first-class talents will fall off because they, oh, I'm so good anyway, why should I work? You know, oh, I'm just... So, never say never about the student. I think that's very important, that you always think that there's a potential there for something, some kind of progress. This is not very clear, not even to me, but that's what I have to say right now.
Who would like to be next? Monday, did you go?
Thank you. I kind of feel we're in the business of communication. Playing an instrument is something like speaking a language. And we as teachers and students are trying to find the best way to communicate. So the business of evaluating the people that come to us, the people that come to you, is necessary. I look at a trumpet player, and if an embouchure needs to be straightened out, I can't feel that that person can speak well enough unless he has the strength or the range or the sound that will make him outstanding in the person who's going to speak. So these things need to be straightened out. So there's a lot of technical things that we get bogged down. We get bogged down with sometimes. But in the end, it is what we say and how we say it. And if we have an opportunity to do this, either with a chamber group, with a big orchestra, or just in our own way, I feel extremely fortunate that I've had the opportunity, and still do, to express myself in one way in my life through the instrument. And I am very sensitive to the students who come to me in what you've just said about how great the desire is and how they want to also express something within themselves. And it's usually something very sensitive. And this, I think, also can be appreciated. If we try to add up what it takes, as you just said, some people make it by absolutely hard, relentless work, even though some things may be much harder for them. Each of us has to find out for ourselves. And if there's even a small success along the way, I think it's worth every moment that you put into it.
Thank you.
All right, Shirley. Well, I have maybe some rather peculiar ideas about teaching, but they may be a little different. But for instance, I like instrumentation to augment the human intellect, not to replace it, but simply to augment it. Human brain's a magnificent tool. People tend to think in different ways, though. They have different forms of excellence. One person may think just beautifully in terms of color, spaciousness, and the perspectives that are so valuable in art. My wife is a fine artist, and she draws so beautifully. I remember making a painting when I was in school, and the teacher said, "For heaven's sakes, what is this?" And I said, "It's a lilac bush, but it's autumn." In other words, there was really nothing on it. And I just don't think very well in terms of color and space, but I think very well in terms of recall of sound, recognition of sound, color of sound. I recognize a great deal about that. There are people that I know that don't do this so well. They think beautifully in terms of logic. I think they found through psychological testing that people have abilities in their brain that may not be developed, but have the potential of development. In other words, the person I have in mind, one former student of mine, who came to me at a time when I was very much interested in the psychology of function, physical function, and thoughts that tend to bring about motor responses and how we use them in music. This young man would have qualified to being tone deaf. In other words, I would sing a note, he could not sing the note. In other words, if I go bomb, most of you could immediately respond to that and reproduce that pitch in whatever octave you liked. He could not do that. I would test him in every way that I could in terms of recall and recognition, and he qualified in most respects that he was tone deaf. Finally, I got him to think back to his childhood years in school, and he finally came up with a crazy little tune, something like, oh, I think it was, "Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, it ain't gonna rain no more. How the heck can I wash my neck if it ain't gonna rain no more?" It was a very silly little thing that he had learned as a child. And he sang it in tune, all the intervals, everything was fine. It indicated to me that somewhere in that brain there was the ability to have recall of pitch and recognition. In other words, there was something interfering with this. We speak of instrumentation. At that time, I was interested in the augmenting of our abilities by bringing more than one sense to bear on a subject. I started this student with the aid of a Strobocon, a 12-window job, a tape recorder, and a piano. And we immediately put the instrument down for a while, and we started just a recognition of program of watching a wheel and hearing a pitch at the same time. When the wheel stopped, we knew that there was an intonation factor. I didn't ask the student to repeat the pitch after me. I just had him listen in silence, but to have recall in his head, start a pattern of recognition. We used a tape recorder so that afterwards, whatever pitches were being recorded were actually being played back in tape, and they could be, again, observed through the sense of sight, which is one of our very powerful learning senses. We immediately started this program of developing the regions of the brain that have to do with recall of pitch. We began to make very slow progress, but there was definite progress, enough to warrant some indication that this was a proper route to go. And I admit we used instrumentation in the beginning to augment his senses, because when he would try to think and recall, he would set up a pattern of motor function, but he would lose in the brain what he was trying to actually accomplish as pitch. When you want to have, if you have a student or if you have problems in this manner, if you retain in the brain, if somebody sings a note or plays a note, you have to be able to retain that note in your brain, and then you imitate it. You can't let it go from the brain, or there's nothing to imitate. When you set up the physical patterns of function and that sound has disappeared from the brain, you will actually be unable to reproduce that note. And it has to be a retention in the brain, and you develop this retention by simply challenging the brain. If a person can't walk, he has to learn to crawl first, but he goes from crawling to walking to running. So we have to start at the level a student can cope with. But by doing that, the young man I have in mind is in one of the professional symphony orchestras today. He has a fine career in music with a fine recognition and recall of sound, which shows that it can be done. I feel very strongly when we teach, we're dealing with a human being. Now, we have a student come into the studio and play for us. The teacher has to become sensitive to what the student is like, what he thinks. Not just, we must have a message that we impart to a student, but we must know, can he receive the message? In other words, is there a language difficulty? Is there a factor that the student thinks along different lines, maybe very intelligent, more so than the teacher, but cannot comprehend because he is not used to the verbalizations. He may not be used to the patterns. There are multiple tools that we use to establish two-way communications with students. What I'm very interested in is the fact that when we deal with brass players, we're dealing with a phenomena that's quite different from, you might say, the musician is going to study cello or piano. When the piano is sent out from the factory sends out an instrument that has built-in pitch vibration, it has built-in resonance. It requires a motor function. Somebody must provide motor activity, or that pitch vibration cannot be achieved. Now, I have great respect for pianists. My mother was a marvelous pianist. I love the instrument. It's tremendously difficult, requires tremendous development and ability on the part of the human playing the piano. So when I say this, it's not a put down, but you can run a cat down the piano keyboard and you will get sounds. In other words, it may not be great music, but nevertheless, the factory has sent out an instrument that has already been set up in terms of pitch vibration and resonance, and it requires motor function from then on. We go to the opposite end. The human voice, you have in the person, under control of the nervous system, you have the motor functions, you have pitch vibration based on resonance, you have based on the vocal cord activity, and you have resonance based on the body chambers where air is going to be resonated and reflected. All three are part of the human being. The brass player gets from the factory an instrument that has resonance built in, but does not have pitch vibration built in or motor function. In other words, out of three basic requirements for sound, pitch vibration, resonance, motor function, only you have resonance built in with its peculiar laws into the brass instrument. That means the player must provide the motor activity. This is done through the breath. He has pitch vibration, which is done through the vibration of the embouchure. He has resonance according to the partials. The acoustics of the instrument are quite different than the other instruments involved. It's primarily sympathetic resonance. In the piano, you have what we call forced resonance. You have one soundboard that resonates all frequencies. You must alter the brass instrument to resonate all frequencies. It has its partial laws that must be obeyed. To bring this into being as function, then, the brass player has to be handled so that the dominance in his learning is based on the ability to have recall and conceptual thoughts of sound. In other words, there has to be the ability for the vocal cord activity to leave the vocal cords and go to the vocal cords of the trumpet, the embouchure. It has to vibrate according to certain pitch frequencies. Now, this is done by activity in the brain going down the nerves to reflex activity that is built up in the tissues in the lip. And this encouragement, right from the very first start, you take a young child coming in for a lesson. What I do, in a pedagogical sense, so I'll take a youngster, when he comes to my studio, I consider him an elementary artist, extremely elementary. But he is still in an art form what I do, I take his trumpet and his mouthpiece, and I play one note, and I make him listen to one note. I make him try to absorb the sound of that. I may play it as poorly as I can, make a really atrocious sound, then I try to play it to the best of my very limited ability on trumpet to have a very good sound, so the discrimination is started up very early. I encourage the student to study the sound because he wants to study the instrument. I want him to study the sounds of the instrument, so the dominance is not the physical aspect of the trumpet, but the musical aspect of the trumpet or horn or trombone or tuba as a tonal phenomena. So as he's learning to create sound, he is learning to play the instrument. The human being will want to know how to proceed because in all the phenomena of life outside of the human body, you will find that analyses, learning what to do, follow directions, the ability to proceed intelligently is to know what you're doing. You can never know what you're doing with your own body. You can know what you want the body to accomplish by throwing a ball, or walking, or talking, or eating, or using your body for the various things in life. But the intellect of a human being is to cope with life around you, not life within you. By that I mean, if you analyze your thoughts, you'll find they are primarily based on the ability to control yourself in relationship to your external environment. That's to people and to whatever you're trying to accomplish through the day. But how much control do you have over peristalsis, over homeostasis, over the alkaline acid relationships in the body? You have other levels of the brain that take care of the body and allow it to function according to what you want to do when you throw a ball or whatever you're trying to accomplish with your body, or walk or talk. The thinking level of the brain at that time is free to cope with the other phenomena of life around you. Now, when we turn inward, and we have to use our bodies, we'll say, for athletics, for dancing, for athletic procedures, or for playing musical instruments, there are certain laws that you have to follow. When they say paralysis by analysis, this is a very true statement. You cannot use the tremendous ability of the human brain to analyze yourself based on the channels of information that come up from your body to the thinking levels of the brain. There is just no way you can do this. You have sensory nerves, in other words, that will carry information from outside of your body to the brain. The sensors will be the sense of sight, powerful, powerful tool. Sense of sound, tremendously powerful tool. Sense of touch, the sense of smell, sense of taste. There are all sorts of sensors that will receive information and transmit it from without to within, to the brain. To influence the external environment, you do it on a completely altered basis. The external environment, you must use psychomotor activity. In other words, to do anything, if I touch this microphone, I use motor systems. There's feedback that comes through the sensory system. We'll always be aware through proprioception of a position of the arm or the hand. We'll get some information back, but the primary functions are motor functions, not sensory. When we play a brass instrument, we are using primarily motor activity. There is a component of sensory feedback, but to communicate to somebody else, there has to be psychomotor activity. Now, what this means, as I talk to you, I am not aware of laryngeal or pharyngeal or lingual or labial activity or respiratory activity. I'm aware of my message. There's a flow of words. Tremendously complex things are happening in my body for me to deliver information to you. I don't know from nothing about that. What I've learned about this, I've learned by studying other bodies, not my own. In other words, the ability to analyze yourself is extremely limited. You can analyze your products, what you're trying to accomplish in life. You can analyze through certain parts of your anatomy where there's more feedback, like in the fingers, proprioception. We have a nervous system that tells us what's happening in this particular region of our anatomy. You don't have this in your embouchure. In other words, the functions of the embouchure are based primarily on the seventh cranial nerve carrying messages, just like a wiring hookup from a tape recorder. We have a message that comes from a computer activity to the lip where you have developed reflex responses to stimulus. In other words, you don't control the lips, you control the message. In controlling the message, you have controlled the embouchure. The embouchure is not made up of a simple muscular group. It is not the orbicularis oris. It's made up of many groups that feed in, that cause the lip to be able to retract, to protract, to elevate, to depress, to vibrate, in other words, at different frequencies. And this is something that is so enormously complex, the only hope of success is to find the simple answer. The lip must vibrate. That means it has to be motivated to create sound. In taking a young student, I start them off by demonstrating sound. They want to know how you do it. I don't answer that. I say, try to sound this way. Buzz your lip. I will say that. I let them buzz on the mouthpiece. I take the mouthpiece and just make horrible sounds, make musical sounds, do anything they want with it, but they start a pattern of causation, of buzz. Then I ask them to take their trumpet home and play for their father and try to demonstrate what Mr. Jacob sounded like on his trumpet and his mouthpiece. Very quickly, a pattern begins to form, not of just playing a note, but of sounding a certain way. This is important to the human brain. In other words, the brain of the artist is one, it's like a storyteller, like that of an actor. You have a message for somebody in the audience, and the brain should not be tremendously involved in the piece of brass. It should be tremendously involved in the music you're going to produce with it. That means you have to develop a conditioning in a player. I prefer that the young player is conditioned in the phenomena of sound and phrase and emotions of music, rhythms of music, but I want him expert in music, not in trumpet, not in tuba. I want him expert in the sounds of the instruments. This little psychological twist is very important because so many of the people want to learn the instrument in order to play the music. I want them to learn the music, and while they're learning the music, they're learning their instrument. I put the dominance on very easy music that can be coped with without technical knowledge and so forth, but I want the heavy question to be what the audience is going to hear from this instrument, not the methodology of producing it. They have to do this because of the enormous power of the human brain to acquire information. And you deal with young students, everybody knows the phenomena of the young child, the tremendous ability to learn. In other words, the ability of the brain to gather information is far greater than to impart information. And here we have this tremendous ability suddenly being channeled into an art form. Well, an art form is a form of communication. Sure, you'll have to learn about the communication. Listen, I'm probably using up much too much time here.
It's very interesting, but...
I could talk on this subject probably for hours to come. I'll close this simply by stating that as far as I'm concerned, in a pedagogical sense, I would like very much that the stress comes to a very non-technical way of teaching so that the teacher may understand psychophysiology or anything involved in terms of the human function, but as a player, he becomes a storyteller himself. As a in guidance to others, the guidance is dominantly that of music. That includes qualities of tone, it includes emotions, it includes rhythms, it includes excitement, all sorts of things that are involved in our particular art form. I would like a heavy involvement of that and a lesser involvement in the, the study of meat, the study of tissue function. And I think with that, I'll let somebody else take the floor.
I didn't want to stop Arnold because I was getting such a good lesson. I enjoyed it very much. But let's hear from Dennis Wick now.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Seems to me that teaching is really, as so many of people here have said so very well, a process of communication. First of all, the player does what he does. Then he tells his student what he thinks he does. Then the student hears what he thought the teacher said, and then he thinks he does what he thought the teacher said that he thought he did. Well, my answer to that one is that I really believe that teachers have to communicate on many different levels. And the best level is actually to have the horn in your hand and to play it as well as possible. One of my colleagues laughed at me when I said, well, I've got to give a certain young player a lesson this afternoon. I'd better do some practice. You're practicing to give a lesson. But of course, because I'm in terrible shape right now. I mean, we had to do is a Bruckner Symphony, and really I have to get myself a bit more flexible. So do some practice to give a lesson. And I think that's most important. Well, communication. Really, what one hears from so many students is enthusiasm, perhaps very strong motivation. It has to be channeled, of course it does. And I think the role of the teacher is to try to make things as clear as possible. Try to lead the student forward in easy steps. Try never to demoralize a student. It's so easy to do that. And actually, if I play badly at a lesson, in a sense that's a kind of encouragement. Because nobody's perfect, me least of all. So I think that teaching is a very responsible job. It's nice to think, as Mr. Farkas has said, it's a marvelous feeling when you meet one of your students who is in a professional job and playing well and playing your way. It's a great feeling. And for me, I've taken it a couple of stages further because I have several of those. But now my students and my students' students are teaching my way. Well, I didn't invent it, of course I didn't. But I have always been rather analytical and have tried to formalize things, to make it easier for people to understand, so that, take your teaching in steps, always different for everybody, because everybody's different. I don't think I've ever had two students that have worked in exactly the same way. And although it's a great compliment to think that they're imitating oneself as a teacher, it's a very nice compliment. But I have a few very controversial things to say to my students. One of them is, don't believe a word I'm telling you. Find it out for yourself. Experience it yourself. And if you don't agree, tell me so. Let's discuss it. Argue, if you like. It's necessary. I think that with the enormous numbers these days of good teachers, and there are more good teachers and more good players than there have ever been before. And there have always been good players, of course there have, over the centuries, but now there are more of them. I think, sounds a bit grandiose to say it, but I think we're in a golden age of brass playing. I don't think there have ever been so many examples of fine playing and fine teaching, and so much of it in your country, in America. It's a marvelous experience to be here, to hear all these things happening. So I think this enormous responsibility has to be thought of in many different ways. Okay, to make them think for themselves, to give them encouragement, to give them motivation, and by very fast and accurate analysis of what they're doing, to save them time. Because that, for people who are experienced in teaching, is the best gift that one can bestow upon a student. To say, well, now, come on, try this. Try it a slightly different way. Maybe an embouchure is malfunctioning, maybe there are bad habits of breathing, and so on. If you can actually get through some of the barriers, then we can talk about music, which is what I really prefer. We can actually make the music happen. Real technique is undetectable. You should not be aware of technique. Technique is only a means to an end. The end is the music. And I think if we can help the students to make their own way, to make their own music, then that's what we should really be doing.
It would be very difficult for me to enlarge upon these beautiful and almost exalted concepts of teaching, so I'll go the other direction and give you a very homely but perhaps a pragmatic approach to teaching, one that I think is part of our duty also, although it's on a far lower level than we've just heard. And that is this: occasionally I think of myself as almost, rather than a teacher, I'm a tailor a custom tailor. Now, what do I mean by that? If you're a perfect figure of a person, a man that's an exact, beautiful size 42 regular, you can go into a store and buy a size 42 regular suit and come out looking beautiful in it. And if you're a perfect music student, you can go in a music store and buy a book of etudes or a method book and come out being a player. But unfortunately, there are no perfect people. There are no, certainly any tailor will tell you that, and I think all music teachers will tell you that. So when you find out that you're not a perfect 42 regular, you go to a tailor, and he discovers that your left hand, or your left arm is a quarter of an inch longer than your right arm, and that you stoop a little when you walk, and he adjusts for that. And I think in a way, this is what we have to do as a teacher. We do not get perfect students coming to us, the type that could get an etude book and go out on an island for a year and come back a musician. We don't get those kind of students. We get a student who has the left sleeve a little too short, so we decide to lengthen that. I see one student who plays with an extreme pucker because he read in a book that you pucker your embouchure. And I have to tell him, no, you have to relax the corners of your mouth. You're overdoing it. The next student comes in and plays with a bright smile. I tell him, no, you have to pucker your lips a little more. That protect your embouchure against the mouthpiece. Later, I find out that two students get together and discuss their lesson. And I find out that they're pretty sure that I'm a little bit demented. So I think this is one of our duties as a teacher, is to take the good qualities and develop them, but find out what the parts of the ability that are missing, that are lacking, and develop those so that we get a well-rounded player in every aspect, and not just in the one that he's naturally good at. In other words, I think a good teacher develops the problem aspects of playing rather than the good features. I think all of us as students would prefer to practice the things we sound best in, particularly if we're in one of those semi-public practice rooms where other people are listening. We're inclined to play the things that we play best just in case somebody's listening outside the door. But the truth is, if you're a smart student, you're going to practice the things you do worst in an attempt to bring them up to the level of the things you do best. So from a very, as I say, homely and pragmatic point of view, this is one of our duties as a teacher in conjunction with all the other more esoteric thoughts that we heard today. I think we have to keep in mind that we are doing just that. We're tailor-making an instrumentalist from somebody who is less than perfect to start with. Suppose we go on now with questions from you, and see, you can ask the question and direct it to whichever person you wish, or to anyone in general. Can I see some hands on questions? It's very hard to see, but go ahead. That's yours.
Oh, that's mine?
Yeah.
I just wrote down a couple of clues here for what I wanted to say, and one of them is body language. As far as young students, I have had much success with the small tricks that I teach them every lesson, like raising one eyebrow, turning the tongue around, They'll be eager to come back to see what the next trick is. Cut your finger, all that. I think body language and having fun is the most important thing with young students. Whatever, if you are not funny in the first place, go out and study, buy some books.
Anybody else would like to add to her remarks, or shall we have another question?
I'll just add one thing with it. Again, young children, if they're excellent players, they will enjoy competitiveness. Gives them a chance to shine, show what they can do, and of course you can easily motivate a talented player, you know, by bringing in a little bit of competition and places where he can display his abilities. You take the shy person, sometimes you have to activate their imaginations. I frequently will use tools like acting, like displaying rather just like an actor, learning to go through the emotions and so forth and look in a mirror, display various surprise, astonishment, rage, so forth, and show them what imagination can do, and then turn the imagination into what can be done in the phenomena of sound too. And we take music that we know that they can cope with, so that they're starting from a base where they can cope with it, and we put in to a practice a little sense, not of frustration, but of success, by doing something with maybe the phrase, increasing the ability of the phrase, by showing how to get a little excitement or a little sadness in the music. And the human mind, being what it is, very quickly tends to go along those lines once they sense accomplishment rather than the frustration. I think you really have to work with their imagination quite a bit.
Another question? Yes, over here. Yes. Mhm.
I have a problem with my teaching. A lot of my students, I tend to make too many points along about the same level, and I sense their attention span draining after a while, and I feel like they've gone home not remembering, I don't have any one point that they remember, instead I've given them too much, and maybe all of the points I've made have been kind of on a medium plane, rather than giving them something to take home. Maybe it's a comment on
Anybody have an idea on that?
May I ask how old these students are?
high school, undergraduate, college.
Okay. Now, I feel mine are usually a little bit older than that, but I've had some contact with this. At the end of the lesson, or during the lesson, let me start. At the end of the lesson, I summarize what I've been trying to get across. If during the lesson you can see that the mind starts to wander and they're still interested, I have them make notes. Now, it only needs to be 1 or 2 words. Now, I think you said, which is probably true, that you might be giving out too much, that it is necessary to drive very few things home, and then you work from that the next time. But the summarizing, I think, is important, and then at the end you say, well, I want you to do 3 things this week. And if one has to do with the breath, then they must, or I will ask sometimes, what can you remember from the lesson? And I also will add that if a person can remember 40% of what I'm trying to get across, I think that's a success. So perhaps you might not want to expect too much. But at the same time, if they go home with 2 or 3 things that they really feel that you want them to do, it very often will be successful for the next set of 2 or 3 things at the next lesson.
I think in my own case, as a student, I remember having the same problem, that I had too many things to think about. Later, when I studied golf, I had the same problem. By the time I had my left elbow out correctly, and well, I couldn't hit the ball anymore. Whereas I could do it in an instinctive way, not very well, but it was better than the thought-out method. And so I've tried to watch this very thing that you're talking about with my own students. Rather than give them too many things to think about, I've often thought that in a way we're something like the FBI. We have a public enemy number 1, and when we capture him and put him away, then public enemy number 2 becomes number 1. And so I look at the problems that the student has. If it's one of breathing, I would call that enemy number 1. Until we solve that, I really don't emphasize all the other problems, because I think we are better off to solve them one at a time. As soon as the breathing problem is solved, if it ever is, then we go on to public enemy number 2, which might be intonation or something of that sort. But I find that in our eagerness to impart all we know, we do often give too much in one lesson. You know, we should give them bite-sized ideas which are easily digestible. Would you like to say something?
Well, I would think it depends entirely on the age of the student. I've had some people over the years who are so slow that you have to just take it one bite at a time. But on the other hand, they're all different, and some are so quick that it's a waste of time to proceed very slowly. On the other, it's fair to say that, well, the way I see it, that although one would like to be talking about artistry and about music, one is talking about very simple forms of gymnastics or athletics, and one is trying to get very simple body responses in the way of breathing and so on into a reflex situation, so that although one can teach what may be for the student something quite new, it has to be taught in such a way that it becomes instinctive and a kind of motor reaction, I think would be the right expression. So, although one has to proceed slowly to make sure that these things are carefully inculcated, there are some times, in my experience, when one can move at an extraordinarily fast pace. And when I've been working with some people who are extraordinarily talented, I feel that I could go on teaching for 2 or 3 hours and going faster and faster, and that it's all been being taken in. Unfortunately, these occasions are very, very rare. And so one has to work at the kind of pace that every student can take. And every student has to be thought of as an individual, and every type of teaching has to be organized for that individual person.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll yes, right here.
I don't know if this is on the agenda or not. It's part of the unromantic part of teaching a brass instrument. I teach in a school where it seems that 50% of them go in for orthodontia, high school level or lower, and I've got everything pretty well under control for putting the orthodontia on, you know, either a little more pucker or wax or whatever, one thing or another works out pretty well. But when they take the braces off, occasionally I run into a tremendous problem. I wondered if you had any clues, any little clues to how to overcome this. I have one student in particular is extremely advanced, one of the best pupils that I have, very advanced 9th grade pupil, and he's been going on for about a month now, and he can just barely, you know, play middle register a little more.
I've had this experience too with several students who had the difficulty of playing with braces, and you would think then when the braces came off that the life would be doubly beautiful, but actually there's a setback, as you say, and yet there's no logic to it. I believe that yeah, I'd like you to do that.
When a person playing, of course, he's forming habits. There's a conditioning process that goes through, and in the act of playing, regardless of the circumstances of it, you are still getting stimulus from the brain and reflex response from the tissues. When the person changes, like taking off the braces that he's already been partially conditioned to, he immediately has introduced a strange phenomena, and the human brain immediately will start picking it up, and it's a worrisome one. It feels different, and that brain is not issuing a question, it's issuing a statement. It starts asking a question. At that time, there is a lack of a motor activity. In other words, the message that should be traveling from the brain down the 7th cranial nerve to the lip is not traveling down there. He can have the same shape, he can have every shape, but he loses his function, because there is no signal from the brain for that function to proceed. That brain is asking a question: why does my lip feel so bad? Why can't I play? If he would sing in the brain and disregard how the lip feels, he would still play. Many of us in the profession go on the stage feeling just terrible. We may have blisters on the lip. We may have medications that are interfering with our salivary glands. We may be in extreme depression, but we always play because we provide the adequate stimulus of music in the brain, and there are motor responses. In other words, for a lip to respond to thought, it doesn't have to feel good. It just has to sound good, but it does not have to feel good. In fact, in my case, it has been feeling very bad. In recent years, it's been feeling terrible, but I still play. But to do that, you must have the signal in the brain. That means you must have musical thoughts, not questions about, well, I can't play, my lip feels terrible, I lost my braces. Somehow you have to motivate that student to try to get the lip to vibrate and give him the leeway to have bad sounds and bad results for a little while and move him back into good results. You can't do it from silence. So you might want to introduce some surprising phenomena to him, like playing on the mouthpiece, or playing on the mouthpiece and jumping up and down or running around the room until it starts up. But he can't do it by analyzing his embouchure. He has to do it by trying to create music for somebody, regardless of whether it's successful or not. Once they make the breakthrough, it's very easy to get it back into good music. And he's better off without the braces, I'm sure.
As we're approaching the most important item of the day, dinner time or relaxation time, I think we should have just one or two remarks from each of us, just giving sort of a thumbnail idea of what you think teaching's about. Why don't we start with Armando? Oh, my goodness. Oh, just short. Thanks.
Well, I hope I understand you, what teaching is about. Well, I think probably it's helping the person. You are both there to find a way that will make the student play in the best manner. So it is up to us as teaching is to find ways which not only that person will understand mentally, but we're able to do physically. The third thing is the concept of sound, which is within one's mind. We draw a picture of it by words, we draw a picture of it by playing, we draw a picture of it by listening to records, hearing other people play, and then from all of this, we put together someone that's going to be outstanding, hopefully, and that will be able to realize a way of getting a job.
Yeah, I had a commercial I would like to do. That's for a book that I just found, and it is written by a very famous teacher, but a cello teacher, namely William Pleath in London. I have to say, if you just cut out the word cello and put horn in there, trumpet, tuba, whatever you want, at least the first introductory part is wonderful, wonderful written, his philosophy on teaching and his philosophy on practicing. I really recommend that as literature. William Pleath, it comes out in the Yuhi Menuhin series of music. Now, the other thing I wanted to say was a story, I think it is from France. A new teacher came to a school. It was a regular school. They told her that she would get a special class with students that were above average intelligent. So, therefore, she could also expect above average results. Of course, she was very happy. She went to work with great enthusiasm, knowing that her kids were special. And during the year, she worked with them. If she occasionally would get a bad result, she would know that this was just a little slip there. Come on, I know you can do better. I know you're special kids. And that this would be her attitude. And right enough, after the year, the results were above average. Now, you all understand that this was not a special class. It was another B-flat class. Of average students and average IQ. Now, the scary part of that story is that if you expect good results, it's more likely that you will get them. The other attitude could be, if you get a bad result from somebody, yeah, I knew, well, oh. That's enough. That's enough to discourage. It could be enough to discourage somebody, rather than saying, hey, I know you can do better, come on, you know. And I think that's really what the teacher is, to consider all the students to be special.
Dennis?
Well, for me, teaching is about learning. And if I stop learning, I get terribly bored. I think one can learn from every student. One can learn for oneself, one can learn for the next student. And it's a continual broadening of experience. Sounds a little bit pious to put it that way, but it really is. And I think the worst feature of teaching is letting oneself get bored by it. And the best feature is that one can actually get a lot of stimulus, a lot of interest, and the business of making an absolute no-hoper into a mediocre player is often much, much more rewarding than teaching somebody who was going to be good anyway, and maybe saving them 6 months' work by getting it right, or saving them having to go into any blind alleys and come out again. So I think providing one enjoys it, one gets stimulus from it, and one learns from it, teaching is something that I should like to be doing for a long time.
Arnold?
I think the finest form of teaching there is demonstration. In other words, young musicians should hear fine musicians playing at the level that they're playing. I often thought when we traveled with their brass quintet, that why didn't they put us in the sections with the players in their marching band or concert band and let us play with these high school boys, with Bud Herseth playing trumpet, I'd be playing tuba, with their section where they can hear a fine player playing the music that they're playing, not something that is beyond them. But demonstration, to me, as Mr. Wick said earlier, is one of the finest forms of teaching I think that there is. I'm required, based on the type of teaching that I do, to work in many levels. I teach respiratory function. Well, I teach things of that type away from music. We put the instruments down and we work always away from the music. When we get back to the art form, as the breath is normalizing, we're back to music. When the instrument is in the hand, I still want the storyteller. He has to develop scales, he has to develop his conditioning, but I still want an artist in front of me. I don't care what state the artist, whether it's elementary or advanced, but teaching is providing a series of challenges that musicians overcome and progress. They're progressive challenges and they keep going, and the art of teaching is involved heavily in guiding students through these ever-increasing challenges.
I'd just like to add one thought. I think that we have a tremendous responsibility in appraising our students honestly after we've worked with them long enough to give an honest appraisal, because it would be very dishonest to let a student believe that he has the talent to go ahead and become a professional when he might be doing something else that he's better suited for. Music is still a marvelous art form, and I've told students in the past, I don't think you'll make it professionally, but I think you have a marvelous hobby and you should enjoy it to the fullest. But I think that somewhere along the line we do owe them this appraisal, and an honest one. And I'd just like to say I think that we have an awesome responsibility as teachers. We have so much to do with the future life of the student, whether they'll be a musician or not a musician, their philosophical outlook. Everything that we do has an influence on our students' lives, and we should take this responsibility very seriously. And when we do, I think we'll find that we have one of the most rewarding professions that one can be in. I think I'd just like to thank my colleagues for their wonderful remarks, and I know they have given me a good lesson today, and I hope you have all received one also. Thank you.